also I've started this new audiobook all about like the early history of Britain colonization
Okay,
and like
before you start, I was actually thinking it would be a neat thing to start every episode talking about like something we read. Because I have
okay,
like a cool, like it's not nearly big enough to do an episode about, but I read a really cool article this week too. So
cool. Well,
I was,
yeah, this is like a random one-off, but that's a good idea. Okay, I actually already did start the video.
oh,
Um, uh,
perfect. Okay, go
wait,
ahead.
okay, so
Welcome.
one random historical tidbit I learned this week while reading a book on early British history was not early British history, but the colonization of America, is that Britain apparently had a few forays into sending their convicts off to distant lands and islands when they were becoming too much of a nuisance. I know Australia is a famous example of that, but they did that a
Yeah.
few times. And one example is they took 10 people and sent them to an island off of South Africa with nothing but a packet of turnip seeds and a shovel, which, first of all, I think is just so incredibly rough. Just kind of comical. The
They
whole
couldn't
story
even
is,
give them turnips. They're like,
yeah, no, just turnip
"Please."
seeds. And it gets worse. And when they arrive there, immediately a bunch of indigenous people started kind of posturing threateningly and moving towards the camp. And so they kind of got really nervous, and there's only 10 of them and they're all unarmed. So they left, snuck away and kind of snuck away to an even smaller island. And for like years lived off like mussels and seals that were sunbathing on the rocks and like just somehow survived. And eventually a ship came by, took pity on them, and three of the 10 prisoners eventually somehow made it back to Britain. And then within hours of arriving back in Britain, were arrested for purse snatching and hung. It's just like a very dark, awful story, but I find it so funny. Oh man, that's all.
That's
That's all I
brutal.
got. Yeah, that's my historical tidbit for you for that week.
There you go. History's great.
Yeah.
My weird article that I read this week. So it's sort of I shouldn't say well-known fact, but it's like a commonly held like idea about ancient Greek writing that the colors that they use are really bizarre and difficult to like unpack. Like they'll use the same color to describe like human skin as they'd use to describe like grass, or they'll use like the same color to describe like wine and the ocean, and like all these really bizarre like equivalencies they seem to draw between colors. And I was reading like an article about how some people theorize that in a lot of proto languages, as they're developing colors, they first discern things like in terms of like brightness and like shine and things like that,
Yeah.
and that it's only later that we start to differentiate like hues. So like they didn't have a concept of like describing that something was green. They were really describing sort of like the texture of it and like how the light bounced off of it. And same with the oceans. When they say like the ocean is winey, they mean that it like shimmers like a glass of wine,
Right.
not that it's like that color. It was
Crazy.
really
Yeah.
interesting. But
Makes
then like
sense.
as they always do, they like reappropriate the word. So now like the word means green, but they weren't saying
Right.
people had green skin.
Yeah. Just the language hadn't developed such that they could express that.
Yeah, it was a pretty neat read.
Cool. Yeah. I've heard also when we develop language that covers more colors, we're able to recognize more colors as well. Like the brain's able to better categorize and take
That's
in
absolutely true.
nuance and difference when we have
There's
that.
like an artifact in our language where until we started exploring the tropics, we didn't really differentiate orange from red in English. And so a lot of like the sort of old sayings, like saying someone has red hair, for example, like it's not red, it's orange. But when we started saying that, we didn't have a concept of orange. And the word orange actually comes from the fruit rather than the other way around, because we didn't have a color before that.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Fun facts of the week.
Yeah, and I figured I would start off this video with some thoughts on, yeah, so this video is going to be on, first of all, wait, I'm going to start that over. I'm going to edit out the part where I throw out the cat anyway. Okay, so I'm going to start off this week's video, which is going to be about John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, with some thoughts on where I'm coming from and how my thoughts and perspectives have shifted while reading this book. And also I should mention what book I did read. It's John D. Rockefeller, The Original Titan by J.R. MacGreggor.
Interesting.
And coming to this video, I was basically wanting to justify my desire to glorify John D. Rockefeller. I'm definitely a fan of his, and I wanted to basically validate my being a fan of him. And I definitely learned more ways in which he was unscrupulous as a businessman than I was willing to first admit. And I had to balance my perspective with seeing him as more of a nuanced whole person. And I definitely evolved in that respect, but I still think I would like to learn more about the ways in which he pushed people out of business, because this book seemed to reference things that I'm not sure if it actually talked about all the examples of which it was referencing, and I'll kind of talk about what I mean by that.
Is it a contemporary writing, or is it like recent? Like,
I believe it's a recent writing.
Okay.
That's actually a good question as well. When was this book written? Unfortunately, it
I know
doesn't have that.
he was written about a lot in his lifetime as well.
Yeah, well, I know it definitely covered a little bit of the period after its death, so it must have been a little bit after, but maybe I'll just like throw that in there in like a little like bubble. It was written.
The one I'm editing right now, I'm putting like a little space at the bottom where I have like Googleable stuff, like whatever we're talking about. I have like a little search keyword deal.
It's a great idea. If I happen to not know a date or whatever, I'll just throw that in the video in a little blurb.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I'm just going to kind of talk about, there's kind of three things I want to cover. His general life, what I see as his more noble attributes and more noble aspects to him, and what I see as the more like questionable, duplicitous aspects of him, and how they balance together into a whole person. But I'll just kind of talk about his kind of general life and what I see interesting about it. And if you have any questions, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, no, I'll let you
grill me away. Yeah, John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839. He was born to parents William and Eliza, and he actually had an interesting history where his father William was a con man who would sell different kind of elixirs town to town, and he would often pretend to be deaf and dumb and go into taverns in these new towns and overhear conversations and try to acquire facts about people and sell them elixirs to basically dupe them out of money. And he actually met a local girl and fell in love with her and was going to marry her, when he actually learned that there was also a very wealthy person who ended up being Eliza. And he learned that she came with a dowry and decided, well, I want to make $500 marrying this person instead. And so ended up marrying the rich person. Well, actually, first she said, I can't marry you because you're deaf and dumb. And he's like, I am miraculously cured, and was miraculously cured. Yeah. And apparently that was enough for her, and they got married. But he was such a, oh man, he married Eliza and had 2 children with her, but also ended up not marrying, but had 2 children with the original person he fell in love with while she was working as a maid in his house.
Oh my God.
So he had children with 2 different women in the same house, and his wife was not aware of the whole thing.
She didn't know they were his kids then, I guess.
No,
yeah.
And even John D. Rockefeller, it's not known if he knew the nature of, like, if he had those half brothers and sisters. Jeez. Yeah, so that was found out quite a bit later. And anyway, she ended up moving out of that house, and John D. Rockefeller's father ended up moving from kind of town to town and leaving them often to go make money and also visit his other family. He ended up getting charged with rape at gunpoint and was on the run from the law for a bit. And so John D. Rockefeller ended up being very kind of ashamed of his father when he learned of all of the indiscretions and immorality, because John D. Rockefeller was raised as a devout Baptist. His mother Eliza was very had a lot of conviction and raised them with a lot of humility and frugality. They were very against waste, like not just because they were poor, but because just in principle, it's part of their faith. And they grew up poor in such a way that like their neighbors had to actually buy the children's school books for school. That's kind of where they were at. And yeah, growing up, his father apparently would constantly be trying to trick and scheme and scam his children to make them sharp. That's a little interesting factor. And also they were just very, very always trying to pinch every penny and just no unnecessary spending. And then eventually John got a job as a bookkeeper at 16 and started making a very good wage because he quickly developed a reputation for being very precise, very dependable. And when someone left the company that I was working at, he ended up making a very solid wage for 16 and immediately started engaging in benevolent philanthropic enterprises where he would actually give money to the abolitionist movement. He was a big believer, like many Baptists at the time, that slavery was wrong. And actually he wrote an essay in high school all about how slavery was just detestable and completely against the values of American freedom. And also later in life, this is kind of skipping a little bit of time, but the woman he ended up marrying was very involved in the Underground Railroad and was stopped in the Underground Railroad. And so the whole family on both sides was very passionate about the anti-slavery movement. And yeah, that's pretty cool. He ended up joining a company with the Clark brothers, these two brothers, and they did quite well. They were buying and selling food products, but eventually John D Rockefeller developed a distaste for how the Clark brothers ran their business. He thought they spent too much, weren't thinking long term, were wasteful. They bought a boat, and this really bugged John.
Yeah.
And eventually, and they would always kind of threaten whenever John would try to say, we should get another loan for the bank. They would always oh, well, if you want to make all these decisions, maybe you should start your own company. And that eventually was a bluff that John called and left the company. And ended up starting a company with this guy, Samuel something. I forget his last name. Maybe I'll put it in the blurb below. But he was a chemist who was working on the cutting edge to develop kerosene out of oil. So eventually the Clark, I skipped a bit. When Rockefeller was still involved with the Clark brothers, they got involved with oil as a side project. And through that, they met this chemist and started producing kerosene, which was currently used for lighting lamps at night for the lower and middle class. Previously, whale oil was used, and when kerosene started being used, there was a competing source of illuminates for the poor middle class. And so eventually, John got in. Yeah, that's basically how he got into the oil business. And the second he got in, he was kind of all in. At least when he got in by himself with his own company, he was kind of all into the oil business. And he immediately started just buying up oil refineries. That was his kind of go-to practice. He would start a few as well, but he generally tried to buy up as many as he could. I don't want to miss anything here in the general story of things. And through all that, he eventually met his wife and had 5 children. But and then through running Standard Oil, there's a series of points in his career where he met different kinds of competition, and he dealt with them in various ways. The first one is that he had the emerging technology of electricity was becoming a competitor for his kerosene for illuminating houses at night. And he ended up spreading a lot of rumors. And he used his financial, his power to... He used his power to influence people and in papers to spread rumors that electricity was more dangerous than it was. He ended up failing, and electricity took over and outcompeted. And just because of how much more efficient it was for lighting houses, he ended up losing that battle. Next was alcohol. Alcohol was going to be used for, so basically cars started being invented, and that was great for him because he could use gasoline for cars. And but there was also the competitor of alcohol. Alcohol was also used in early cars, and so he ended up, well, he was also staunchly against alcohol, being a Baptist, and never drank or smoked in his life, but he also saw an opportunity to fund the prohibitionist movement. In doing so, make it much more difficult for the competitors to yeah,
Yeah.
use that for cars as well, for the fuel for cars. And so he ended up succeeding in that. And he wasn't obviously the only person pushing for that, but he funded that, and that ended up happening where people who were producing alcohol for fuel for cars were legally required to add kerosene to it, so that it was like poisonous to drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it became prohibitively expensive to produce that for fuel for cars for that reason. And so Rockefeller kind of won that battle. And also electricity was being used in many streetcars and many early cars at that time. And General Motors, with which Rockefeller and Standard Oil had an exclusive contract, was able to push the early electric cars out of the market. And it's often speculated that Rockefeller had a hand in that as well, because he was so involved in that, but there's no kind of direct evidence that but he obviously benefited very much from that. So let's look at my notes here. Yeah, so he bought up papers to kind of push his side of the story. When he would produce these new products, because when he started producing oil, he also hired scientists to make hundreds of products out of the gunk that was previously thrown into streams and rivers and just tossed out. And this is obviously a good thing from most perspectives, but also he did produce a lot of propaganda to sell these products and present them as just the best thing ever, which is questionable for sure. And so he maintained his monopoly around Standard Oil in a variety of ways. He also he eventually got into the pipeline business and was very serious about maintaining a monopoly around pipelines. He had a few battles with different competitors where he was able to stop them from building pipelines. And eventually this came to a head when the Tidewater Pipeline Company started building a pipeline, and Rockefeller was forcing them to, he would buy up lots of property and force them to go around. He would have railroad businesses prevent them from building onto their property. He would basically lobby and bribe politicians. He did everything he could to stop this from happening, but it still went through. But it was so public, the way he tried to stop Tidewater, it was so well understood that this caused such public outcry that this was the incident that caused the legislation to be passed and eventually broke up Standard Oil in 1911. And so that's like a very, very broad overview.
The legislation being like the antitrust stuff.
That's right, yeah. And it ended up breaking him up, Standard Oil, into 34 separate entities.
Mm-hmm.
And so my view of him is that I think there's a lot of views of him that he's kind of just a power-hungry, money-obsessed individual. But he does have a few famous quotes and a few aspects to his life that I think give doubt to the idea that he was obsessed with money. For one, he always used to say that if your only goal is to make money, you will never succeed. That's a paraphrase, but that's essentially what he was saying.
Yeah.
And he also taught his son the famous Bible quote that it's more difficult for a rich man to enter the gates of heaven than for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle.
Yeah.
And he would, for all of his children, one of them died very early, but for all of his other 4 children, he raised them to be very frugal. He would never buy them his son wore hand-me-downs from his sisters until he was 8. Apparently his John D. Rockefeller's wife, upon learning what their son wanted for Christmas, became very excited because now she could say no to him. So the idea of depriving their children of like wealth and opulence was like a pleasure almost to their so they raised their children to be very frugal. They never spent anything essentially for any kind of extravagant lifestyle. They took the idea of just living a very pious lifestyle very seriously. And And also John D. Rockefeller, from a very early age, even prior to amassing his wealth, gave an incredible amount of charity. There's a common, obviously, like a lot of the charity that took place happened later on in his life, after the Standard Oil controversy and after he had had his reputation destroyed, essentially. And a lot of it was for the purpose of trying to reclaim his reputation, a lot of it done by his son, actually, to try to reclaim the Rockefeller name. And so it's often thought that charity work was just an effort to reclaim a reputation, but I don't think that's really true, because he gave to charity when he was 17 years old. He gave to charity when he was like all through his life, mostly to religious oriented institutions like the Baptist Church, which was also doing outreach programs to lots of different causes. But he also founded 3 different universities, including the Chicago University, the Rockefeller University, the Central Philippine University. He founded the Rockefeller the Rockefeller Foundation, which ended up actually ending hookworm in the South. I'm not sure if you're familiar with hookworm, but that's like a disease that you get from stepping in like shit and a little worm. Yeah, and just like many people attribute to the lots of the cognitive difficulties of the South to that. I think that
like
might be
the accent I've heard is like almost entirely explainable by hookworm.
The what, sorry?
The accent, like the Southern accent. I've read that it's like originates, or one of the theories is that it originates with hookworm, because it's not really a traditional British dialect.
Okay, yeah. I've also heard it argued that it descends from like a southwestern British accent, but I guess I don't know. That's
I can't back that up. That's just something I've read.
Yeah, I know Thomas Sowell makes that case in Black Rednecks and White Liberals, but I don't know enough about the controversy to. But yeah, so he definitely did a lot of good through his charitable organizations, and so my view of him is that he thought it necessary to be almost unscrupulous in business. He also had a quote, something to the effect of, "The survival and expansion of big business is simply survival of the fittest." So he was saying it's essentially that which is, I think, a little bit odd, because he would also bribe politicians and create favorable circumstances for himself. So it wasn't quite survival of the fittest. And there is aspects in which he did break away from a purely free market approach. And it's unfortunate that he did that. But he also had an attitude, I think, of just generally, in the context of business, one should be ruthless and cutthroat in order to find the most market share and be successful. And I think, based on how he lived his life and then what he did with his money, I believe that his main purpose was to acquire wealth and power to further causes that he believed to be righteous. And
like the ends justify the means, I think, very much describes Rockefeller.
Yeah, and he had obviously contradictions of his nature, like the fact that he did amass so much money while seemingly not valuing it for its ends and not. And also the fact that he took things like honor and honesty so seriously, and yet was known for bribing politicians, and didn't think that was a big deal.
I was going to ping you on, I had read that the breakup of Standard Oil actually made him like an immense amount of money as well.
Yeah.
Like
they were
made like more than he lost in that whole deal.
Absolutely, they were valued at much higher values once broken up than they were previously. So he made a lot of money, and for like the last 20 years of his life, like all he did was just take drives around the country. He did a drive once a day to the countryside. He would play golf and just give dimes to people. That's like all he did, was just like hang out, just like. And so I definitely think that he was also one of the things he did, and this is one of the things about the book that I read that makes me question whether I should read more about it to get a full picture of it, because it described the way he would coerce his competitors out of the oil refining industry. And it used the word coercion, which I define a certain way.
No word.
Yeah. And but then it went on to describe what he would do. And what he would do was he would approach, first of all, these oil refinery business owners, and he would ask them if they would sell their business. And if they wouldn't, he would use his position through the rail industry where he had a situation where because he was transporting so much oil, he had a special deal with railways where he could transport it at a lower cost.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the same cost was being charged to all of his competitors, and so he had a huge advantage. And it seemed to be this this is what was being described as coercion. But in my mind, that's just good business. You're just producing something en masse in a large quantity to get a better deal. It's like selling things at a big box store to produce so that you have an economy of scale and push out your competitors. To me, that would be a good example of Standard Oil succeeding based on merit and the ability to produce a better quality product, or at least a cheaper product. Whereas, and I would see no issue with that, and certainly I wouldn't define that as coercion. Whereas I would take issue with him bribing politicians and buying up newspapers and trying to buy up land to try to maintain a monopoly and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
this book seemed to some degree, conflate those two, and I wasn't sure if there was some other way in which Rockefeller was known to coerce people beyond simply pursuing an economy of scale that would push out smaller competitors.
Yeah, like I don't think he was violent at all, if that's
No.
like the implication they're trying to make. But definitely, so this is one of the points I wanted to bring up is like I think what we could accuse Rockefeller of in a lot of cases is that like in the truly free market, you have like two parties dealing with each other and making contracts and stuff. But a lot of Rockefeller's approach, at least in the reading I did, was to sort of insert himself into the dealings of other businesses. So if another business is trying to make a deal with the railway that should just be between the two of them, Rockefeller uses his influence to control and manipulate that deal that has nothing to do with him and things like that. And I was curious to get your thoughts on that as like an emergent behavior in the market that I would say is probably negative. Like generally the idea of like exclusive contracts, but also like the more informal idea of I don't want you to like, there's a formal, like we're going to make a public deal that the railway will only ship my oil or will only give me this price or whatever. But there's also an informal, like putting pressure on the railway to not make those deals kind of behind closed doors and stuff like that. I just wanted to generally get your thoughts on the impact that has on the market.
Yeah, well, I mean, he obviously he definitely did that, and he'd also
Yeah.
have rail companies use their power to have, yeah, in many ways he would do that without getting way into it. But
Yeah.
I would say that this is absolutely an example of which he stepped away from that kind of purist free market philosophy, and
Yeah.
it's a difficult thing to approach, for sure. My view is that I think the reputation that he acquired was somehow, in some ways, well deserved, and I think that in some way could be the solution to these problems. If Rockefeller develops a reputation for being this really manipulative and just where he's injecting himself into situations where he doesn't belong in that sort of situation, then he's going to develop that reputation for being someone that people don't want to support in any way. And I do think that the fact that the Tidewater company succeeded in building a pipeline shows that he didn't quite have a monopoly. Even when he was trying to shut it down through all means possible by like in every way he could, the Tidewater company was able to build their pipeline within 90 days. And so I think that Rockefeller, what he did in some ways was very questionable, but I think the way the market would deal with it, in my view, would be to spread knowledge of the ways in which he was acting unscrupulously, and hopefully that would cause more business and support to go to competitors that acted with, less.
Don't you think that reputation idea works both ways as well, though? Like when he acquires that reputation, that also discourages people from even trying to compete with him and things like that as well, because they're going to say like nobody beats Standard Oil, like he has the railways in his pocket, like I don't even want to compete in this space. Like it kind of has a cooling effect on the market as well.
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely does. And I think it kind of takes certain personalities. Like in the book, it describes two individuals, one of which failed to break up Standard Oil's monopoly, and one of which did, which is the owner of Tidewater Piping.
Yeah.
And they were both kind of had a personal vendetta where they wanted to go after Standard Oil's monopoly. And it definitely takes certain personalities to do that. And yeah, it's I think this is an example, especially in an early emerging economy where, because of the nature of it, because it was such a new thing where like the price of oil was going up and down constantly, to a very insane degree. And it was the kind of thing where if you made the certain moves in certain ways, you could just have a foothold. You had a huge dominating effect on the market because if you were one of the ones coming up with it, because Rockefeller was in the right place at the right time, he had the opportunity to be in a much better position to take control.
I think there's like a fair comparison to be made with like OPEC in the modern day, that like it's just like without controlling the entire market, like it controls such a huge piece of it that it can sort of guide pricing and control production and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's definitely one of the more difficult problems for free markets to solve. I think the danger is that if you, I just think that the more functional long-term solutions to monopolies are the ones that emerge from a culture and are established culturally. So for instance, if you have this company that maybe they're charging way too much money for the situation that they're in, I think the solution is to bring more people into the market, and to really do that, you need to have an awareness of what's going on and like funnel people in. And I think the problem is that if you just solve that solution with legislation, like let's say all you do is just break up the companies into two companies, or you say that they can't charge such rates. You're not really. It's like it's kind of like an artificial solution where what you want to do is like if the price is too high, you want to let the price stay high so that it's a financial incentive for more companies to enter, and that actually creates a more, I think, stable solution when it's actually literally more companies, not just one company broken into two. It's the same amount of people producing the product. But if you actually allow the price to stay high, the financial incentive is in place for the actual solution, which is a more long-term incremental growth of the industry that would cause it to be more stable over the long term. So I think, unfortunately, the solutions to antitrust problems or the antitrust legislation tends to undermine what I see as the more stable solutions, which are just allowing those economies to grow. But
that's fair. Do you think there can be a point of no return? Like, is it possible for a company to get big enough that it just controls the market and can completely suppress competition? Like, surely we could say if Standard Oil owned 99.9% of the drillable land and all that, like it would just be impossible for anyone else to like enter that space.
Yeah, and I guess I want to answer this in two ways. First of all, like generally speaking, Standard Oil did operate in a very efficient way. One of the things that Rockefeller took very seriously is eliminating waste and efficiency in general, which is essentially eliminating waste. And so if it weren't for the fact that he was kind of a monopolist and tried to actually protect his monopoly, it could be the case that the market share that he acquired was an expression of how efficiently he operated and what a good job he did. So and it could be the case that someone could gain a vast majority of a monopoly share through just being the best solution. And I think that's what he was trying to do. I think he thought that he could run his business way better than these Clark brothers or all these other people he saw in the business world. And he wanted to just run everything and do it the right way and just take control. And then he could fund his philanthropic enterprises and, do things the way he thought.
Had the mad scientist approach.
Yeah, it's like, I can do this right myself, so I should just...
Nobody else gets it.
Exactly, yeah, so I'm just going to control everything. I should just be essentially like the attitude of a king, but, I should just rule the land because I know best. But he, I think, tried to pursue that position through business. And so there's that could be an ideal situation, a monopoly. But that's obviously not what was happening with Standard Oil. And in that situation where he's having... basically maintaining a monopoly position in part through his efficient practices and also in part through bullying in the marketplace. And in that case, it's like I still want to believe that the best solution is to allow the spreading of information so that the public understands if they're being taken advantage of or if they're being
Hmm.
provided the best possible solution, and through that we can kind of
Yeah,
arrive at the best option. But I'm yeah, obviously that's a belief of mine because we haven't always been blessed with the history to show it to be true or false.
yeah. There's sort of like a hindsight is 2020 built in
Yeah,
there. Like in the time, like people don't think enough, I think, about like he killed the whale oil industry, right?
yeah,
Like he killed a lot of bad, like, and he didn't do it in the most scrupulous ways, perhaps, but like there were some concrete forward movement achieved largely because of his growth of the industry.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, so another like a complete 180 to a completely different topic I wanted to touch on. So often I think we see this today as well, but Rockefeller is perhaps one of the earliest examples where like a both like a an industrialist and like his fan base, if you will, or his apologists, justify a lot of what he did by like the volume of charitable work and donations that he did in his lifetime. And I think it's fair to say he'd be viewed a lot more critically by a lot more people if he had not done that. And so I wanted to put out there as a talking point of like, what is the appropriate amount of charity for somebody like that to do in order to redeem themselves? And how do we gauge such a thing? Like, if that is somehow, you know, polishing his image, then what is the appropriate amount? Did he do enough? Should there have been more? Like, when we look at someone like Jeff Bezos, like, is there a formula or an approach to gauge how much of that he should be giving back? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think because Rockefeller obviously acquired some of his wealth through unscrupulous means, I think
Yeah.
he had to have some ends to justify those kinds of means. And the fact that he did, I think, counterbalances them to some degree in my mind. To what extent that should be necessary, I think is very subjective. I'm not sure. Um,
I
personally, I
don't,
think,
and I should be clear, I'm not saying like a legal precedent. I'm saying more of like a social
yeah,
expectation.
totally. And I think I support that sort of thing. Yeah, and especially in the context of Rockefeller, because his goal was explicitly to dominate the industry, and he literally wanted to be the only oil refinery in the world
Yeah.
at one point. And because that was his goal, and I think he was obligated to give, I would say, the vast majority of that back because he's claiming essentially ownership over this kind of collective infrastructure and this kind of collective thing. Uh, that only makes sense as a moral action if he's going to give the vast majority of it back and only collect a very basic salary for his
Yeah.
own life and existence. And the fact that he did that, I think, makes that in some sense justifiable. But and I think, yeah, if somebody did operate in a much more purist sense and they never bribed politicians and they never uh, acted unscrupulously in various ways, I think personally I would have no issue with them not giving it back
Yeah.
essentially and doing whatever they want with it, or at least it's much more ambiguous in my mind. And I would say it's a lot harder to justify an obligation on their part, any sort of positive obligation. But
Do you know what an indulgence is in the context of the Catholic Church?
no.
So historically, although it is still practiced today, but practiced much more widespread historically, like a lot of merchants and stuff, when they did unscrupulous business dealings and you went to like confess your sins at church, they would quite literally assign like a dollar value, and it was called an indulgence, which is essentially like a donation that you give to the church in order to be absolved of a sin.
Well, I bet they
And they
loved
would,
Rockefeller.
yeah, like, and that's where my mind went to, because quite literally they would be like, and that was how a lot of the big cathedrals got built, is they would sell these indulgences, and sometimes a lot of the times it was like really, what for the time were seen as horrible things like prostitution and things like that, where
Right.
they'd be like, yeah, like you can go do whatever shit you want to do as long as you pay like a certain amount to the church to balance things out. And it's a very similar model, I think, to what you're describing. And there was
Yeah,
literally like pricing, right? Like they'd be like, oh, like a prostitute that's like, 700 shekels or whatever you're doing in the area that you're in. Like
were these prepaid indulgences?
in some cases,
That's
um,
hilarious.
there's a lot of Martin Luther actually was very critical of this system, and near the end, it was frequently done in order to like guarantee that your loved ones would enter into heaven. So they would say that like the priest would pray for like your dead grandfather in purgatory, and he would ascend to heaven if you paid like a certain amount, and it became like extortive. But like for sure, there was prepaid indulgences where you could be like, yeah, like going down to Rome for the weekend, it's gonna be wild. It's like
That's amazing.
here's 800 bolts of cotton, like or
Yeah.
whatever it might be.
Wow,
It's
that's
a pretty fascinating historical system. Yeah,
yeah.
like the big St. Peter's Cathedral, like the big huge one in the Vatican, that was like built all on indulgences, 100%.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's so interesting. I never knew anything about that.
yeah, it's yeah, yeah. That's just what made me think of it because it's like a quite, and I'm presenting it a little bit like sarcastically, like it was less shitty that I'm making it sound, but
Right.
it was like a real thing that
Yeah.
exists, and still like it's not as common today, but it is still a thing you can do, like if you sin in the church or whatever.
I'm sure they're more than willing to, yeah,
Yeah,
come up with a way for you to give them money.
yeah,
That's that's fascinating. Uh,
yeah,
yeah, so I'd say like the main things that Rockefeller did that were particularly noble. Obviously, the pushing the whale oil industry out of the market wasn't intentional, but that did, by some accounts, save the whales because the whales were being hunted to extinction. Many of them were, they were switching which whales they were hunting to because they kept running out of whales.
yeah.
So they were on.
But I don't think he ever said that was like a goal of his. Like
No,
I don't think most people at the time really cared.
no, absolutely. And so that I think can't really be attributed in much a
But it
meaningful
is,
way to him because yeah, he
still
had
a
no.
virtue, I would say.
Sure, a non-intentional one, but a good thing that happened. And he
Yeah,
absolutely also lowered the price of oil. This is also a very open to interpretation number because the price of oil was fluctuating so wildly at the time that to attribute it specifically to him is difficult. But where I have it written down here. Yeah, basically the price of oil went down from 58 cents to about 8 cents when he was largely through his innovations, but also it's the kind of thing where his innovations drive innovations that drive his innovations. And
yeah,
many other companies like Shell, who were the first company to ship oil in tankers in boats, also had a part to play in the
yeah.
drive towards innovation. And
Didn't he like compete with Shell like a lot? Wasn't that like a major competitor to Standard Oil?
absolutely, and actually Shell started as a much smaller company that joined together with another larger company, and the
Yeah,
explicit reason was to protect themselves from the Standard Oil monopoly. So larger companies were forming out of protection because Standard
yeah.
Oil was seen as such this dangerous force that was pushing people out of the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
We could perhaps say like because Dutch Shell goes on to form all of the really predatory contracts in the Middle East and things like that. That's like swindling the Iranian Shah out of all of his oil revenues and stuff like that. So it's important to note that all oil companies were doing unscrupulous stuff at the time. Like,
yeah, for sure. And that's the thing as well. Is like a lot of the industries he was competing with. While he was lobbying the government to, for instance, ban alcohol through prohibition, a lot of the industries, like the electricity industry, was also lobbying the government.
yeah,
And like, oh yeah, apparently, ultimately, I think it was yeah, and that's another interesting point I wanted to make is that, well, it was, sorry. So yeah, when electric cars were a threat as well, he was, one of the main things that ended up pushing that out of the market is, while he was lobbying very hard and pushing and General Motors, they were pushing very hard against the electric cars. Eventually, what ended up winning that war was a oil derrick started pushing out thousands of barrels of oil, and the price of oil plummeted to such a degree that that became the obvious financial road to go down. It wasn't even through lobbying and financial manipulation that they ended up winning that battle. It was ultimately that this the price of oil through just discovering a massive oil reserve plummeted, which I think is interesting. That well, oftentimes these businesses are fighting while using government power back and forth to elect politicians or do whatever they want to do. Ultimately, it's going to be the market in many contexts, like the electricity ended up lighting homes because it was more efficient and cheaper. It didn't matter how much they lobbied the government. Ultimately, Standard Oil won the battle against the electric car, not because of some unscrupulous activity, but because ultimately the price of oil dropped to such a degree. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that while monopolies can form to varying degrees, ultimately market forces will always win out.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up because that was the next thing I had on my list to talk about. And I want to talk specifically about the ethanol-based automobile because I did a lot of reading about it. And like it was perhaps more so than electricity, like poised to be a competing technology.
Mm-hmm.
But the unfortunate, like in certain industries, and I think the automotive industry is probably the best example of this, like a certain amount of standardization is essential because you can't like feasibly, you cannot have like two different kinds of gas stations. Like they're going to use different kinds of, they weigh different amounts. They're going to use different designs. Like there's so much momentum in being like the dominant technology that eventually pushes other things out. And the same thing happened with electric vehicles as well. In that like we're just seeing now with Tesla and other like electric companies, like they struggle to build the infrastructure to do it because like, and automobiles end up getting it, or gas powered automobiles get an advantage because everything's built already. And so I would ask the question, because I think one of the most troubling things about monopolies is that they can stifle economic or like scientific growth and like the development of new technologies through their ability to, and there was lots of this, like because oil wants to win, they build the gas stations, they build the other things. And it's not necessarily because it's a better technology, but because it's able to, it has the resources behind it to build the infrastructure to get there.
Or just gets the contracts. Or whatever.
Yeah. Whereas if we had like more competition in that space, you wouldn't see like, and you know, I guess you could theoretically see companies banding together, but you wouldn't see like Standard Oil and Tidewater cooperating to defeat a common good because they see each other as competitors and they want to win. And if you had more competition in that space, it allows other technologies to compete more fairly with it, perhaps. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I definitely.
And especially, like, obviously nobody knew this at the time, but one of the main advantages of an ethanol-powered vehicle today is that it is much cleaner than a gasoline-powered vehicle. And there's no way for them to know that back then. But had we gone the other way, it would have had dramatic implications.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I absolutely agree that if you have this type of economy of scale, then you erect essentially a natural barrier to entry, where to enter that market or to evolve it in a different direction is very difficult because you have all of this established infrastructure. Another interesting example I heard of this is that when little screws first being developed, a Robertson screw, the little like square-headed screw, is way stronger than the Phillips screw, which is a little cross. But the Phillips screw ended up being used in a big motor vehicle contract, I think with Ford.
Yeah.
Oh, you know about this? Okay.
I know this story, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's why that screw ended up being produced in much larger quantities and for a long time won out over Robertson. But eventually, through the simple superiority of design, Robertson did win back a larger market share. And now in construction, it's the majority of screws used for any solid construction. Like you still use Phillips for like drywall or whatever, but Robertson is for anything serious.
I should note that that's much more true in Canada than it is in the United States.
Oh, man.
Here, the Robertson Yeah, I actually know. Can I share a little bit of it? Like,
Yeah,
I know a
go.
whole lot about this. So,
Cool.
like, the guy who invented the Robertson screw and had the patents was very dedicated to this idea that he wasn't going to produce them. He was going to like license contracts to factories that would let them use his patent because he felt the technology was so superior that it would just win out. So, like, he went with sort of like a franchisee type business model
Uh-huh.
that was less successful in the United States because of exactly what you described. Like, automobiles were the main use at that time. Nails were still very popular for construction. But in Canada, he managed to get a foothold. And in fact, for some time, like Ford vehicles created in Canada used Robertson screws, and the ones made in the United States used Phillips head. But yeah, like, it just goes to show, I think, that poor business acumen can sink a superior technology, and sometimes I
Yeah.
think that's like problematic.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if there's a really easy way to round that, unfortunately. I think the only real solution is trying to develop consumer awareness of better solutions and trying to orient the market in a way that is, actually progress. I know that just a lot of these answers around the free market are so. I honestly, I feel like I'm aware of how pithy they sound and how they don't really feel like they're addressing any concrete things. But I feel like a lot of them have to be cultural, just
Yeah, yeah.
developing an awareness and market knowledge,
So,
consumer
like,
knowledge.
maybe I'll put it to you in the reverse of how it's usually phrased. Do you think it is possible through legislative intervention to make a market more competitive? Like, are there steps you can take to increase competition in a market, or does any intervention by a governing body necessarily reduce it?
I like the idea of saying there should be no positive obligations of companies. I think there should be like negative obligations in terms of the legislation, like they're not allowed to steal and do things. But
Yeah,
I'm skeptical that there's any positive obligations placed on companies, like they're not like they. It I guess yeah I
like something like you should donate to charity or something.
or you should run your company a certain way. You should um, charge these certain prices or I
Would you?
like the
Is it fair to say that perhaps it is like the consumer's job to put those positive obligations on a company, and the legislative body's job to like demand a minimum? Like, the floor and the ceiling come from different
yeah
places.
I would say if and depending on the nature of the government we're talking about,
Yeah, yeah,
the I think the government's function would be to essentially protect people from actual theft and fraud and physical aggression and like the more extreme things, and then it would be the consumer advocate's job and the consumer's job to create uh, a culture where values are respected and supported and all these types of things.
yeah.
And
So,
yeah,
like, in the context of like green technology, perhaps we would say it's the government's job to make sure nobody's dumping in the river, but it's the consumer's job to make sure you're like building and selling new, better technologies.
yeah,
Like,
and we can have like the consumer advocacy groups creating lists of companies that are doing certain things versus others, and it's up to them to do that, and it's up to consumers to actually learn about these consumer advocacy groups so that they can make
yeah,
informed choices. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. And I think the reason this isn't as active today is because we rely so heavily on government, and there's this belief that if we just sit back and vote for the lesser of two evils, then we'll be protected or we'll be
mm-hmm.
funneled towards the best products. And I think we need to remember that nobody really has our back. Ultimately, the government is functionally serving interests. They're serving financial interests a lot of the time. And
Yeah, absolutely.
remembering that nobody has our back, I think would encourage a lot more people to pay attention to what consumer advocacy groups are saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think right
Let
now
me
it
be
doesn't happen.
abundantly clear that I'm not advocating for what we have now.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm talking more theoretically.
Yeah.
I think there can be space, like, so when you study like the optimum models, like, there's a general idea that the more participants there are in an industry, like, the better it will operate. So if you look at something like law or accounting, or dentistry is a popular example, where there tends to be like thousands of participants in the market. Like, if you look at dentists, there isn't a big corporation that's running all of the dentists. Like it's usually little mom and pop shops, and there's a lot of consumer choice to say, if I don't like the way this one runs, I have 500 similar options to choose from and things like that. And industries like that tends to operate more efficiently and find more efficient like pricing structures and things like that. Whereas when you have industries that are, and it's very hard, like you would never see 40,000 dentists collude to control the market because there's just too many to feasibly do it. Whereas when you have spaces that have very little competition, like I mean, automobiles are a classic example because there really aren't that many companies that make automobiles. Like at the end of the day, there's maybe 20 that you could think of, like worldwide, that are serious competitors in the space and not just some guy in his backyard. And there are no mom and pop shops. Like all of them are multi-million-dollar corporations because the barriers to entry are so high. And when you have something like that, you tend to see a lot more collusion. You tend to see a lot more, everyone's going to make the same tires. Everyone's going to do this the same way, that the same way. We're going to maybe work together to lobby the government for certain privileges or whatever you might call it. And I think there can be a place for the government to say, okay, like from either end, either by, I don't necessarily agree that the best way to do it is antitrust. I think a better approach is for the government to like raise the floor, like make it easier for people to compete and enter that space rather than like dragging down the people that are at the top. But I think there are ways we could make it more competitive, which would benefit the consumer, even if it is unequal in the market.
Yeah, and I'm very open to those initiatives, especially if they were community driven. Like if, say, there was an established monopoly around railway industry. If there was a community initiative to support anyone who wanted to start any sort of business that would compete with it. Maybe it's not even a rail industry. Maybe it's a trucking industry, because a lot of the competitors to the rail industry were other types of transport, like trucking and shipping. Like maybe there could be a community initiative to support that sort of thing. Or
absolutely.
And so I definitely like the idea of monopoly busting and creating opportunities and leveling the playing field. And
for sure. Like I think even just like it could be the government's place to protect emerging businesses from that sort of predation. Like if you have a community initiative, and let's say people, you know, pool together $1 million to start an automobile company, you know, the first thing that's going to happen is Ford or GM is going to come into town and crush it. And even having a little bit of government to say like, no, like you have to let them like have access to suppliers and things like that. Like we can't just completely starve them out of the market, I think would go a long way.
Yeah, I like the idea of creating, if not legal precedents, then cultural precedents against things like just the practice of saying you can only supply to me and I'll give you this great deal, but only if you only supply to me. Like that sort of activity, I think, like, I don't think I like the idea of making it a legal precedent, but I like the idea of that being a thing that we're just against as a society. And if people do that, then they should just be seen as shitty people who we don't want to support. And I think that's probably already the case. But
yeah, but couldn't that cultural idea be expressed through the government? Like that's often how they are.
Yeah, I guess.
Like it's hard for a small community to like a town, for example. So let's say you have maybe 10,000 people that collectively want to oppose GM and make their own thing. Like they don't have the resources to fight a multinational corporation, but they might have the resources to lobby like a local legislator and like achieve the space, because the government is big enough to fight with GM, but the town is not. The town will be crushed.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think of, is there any context in which a company, like, is that an inherently bad action to demand exclusive access to service and that they don't. And I'm thinking maybe you're right that there's no context in which that isn't predatory
It's
or isn't.
always like anti-competitive. Like whether you think that's objectively bad or not is perhaps something to discuss. But I don't think there's any way you could say that exclusive contracts enhance competition.
Yeah, and I think I could be argued, especially in this moment, because I can't think of any reason not to. I think I'm agreeing that there could be legislation against that. I would have an issue with, like the other example of, say, where Rockefeller has a deal with the oil company or with a rail company where they ship his oil at a lower cost. I don't think there's any issue with that, and I would
No,
have the issue
absolutely.
with, so I would draw the line probably there.
But it's when that deal becomes and you can't offer this deal to anyone else. Like that's when it becomes problematic. Saying that like any person who's able to deliver 100 million barrels a day can get a better deal. Like that's a natural evolution of the pricing structure.
Yeah.
But
And I think the problem is that unfortunately a lot of these deals are like secret deals. Like when Rockefeller had rail companies deny access to the or he had them deny access to the piping company. He wouldn't allow them to build piping onto their land. That was a informal deal that he just through his financial control. And I think that's a big problem, is that even if we have laws against lobbying, for instance, a lot of the lobbying that happens to government happens through backdoor deals and secret arrangements. And so it's a tough thing to, so I'm fine with that. I think it would be good to oppose those types of things with legislation, but I think because of the nature of the problem, I think it's still going to persist in secret arrangements.
I think there's a certain amount of like in the world we live in now, there have been multinational corporations that have achieved their status through unscrupulous means and maybe wouldn't have in a different market scenario, but now they're here and we have to deal with the demons of our age, right?
Right,
like, I don't think you'd see Standard Oil achieving what it achieved without having access to government resources and things like that. And railways especially would not have the sort of monopolies they enjoyed in that era without like a ton of involvement with the government. But they're there and you have to kind of deal with the demons you have. Yeah,
and I railways also have a fascinating history with monopolies where they did the rail companies joined together and tried to establish monopolies, and those broke down as well through internal competition, where just it makes sense to like have secret backdoor deals. Even if you're part of this cartel of the railroad cartel, you'd make these secret backdoor deals, and that slowly undermined that. Apparently, the steel industry, it was because of the nature in which steel was kind of counted and produced, it was much easier to keep track of what your competitors were doing. And so the cartel in the steel industry was stronger, and that ended up being a big source of the antitrust legislation too. And that one was not broken down before legislation broke it down. So market forces could have, in theory, broke it down, but it was government who came along and ended that one. So I think, I think there are contexts in which it's if it's easier to keep track of what your competitors are doing, depending on the nature of the industry, it might be easier to maintain a cartel. But in lots of the industries, because of just the nature of them, it's like impossible. And I think the rail industry, for that reason, it wasn't possible.
I think like something we circle around a lot is that like with perfect information, it's a lot easier to build a good system. But unfortunately, like there is secrecy, there is fraud, there is distrust, and that's hard to deal with. And it's hard to tell a company that you just have to share your entire business plan, because that's not necessarily great either. But you give them an inch and they'll take a mile.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know.
Have you ever read about, I can't think of the guy's name at all, but it's like there's a Swedish business magnate who completely monopolized the match industry in the beginning of the 20th century. No. And he ended up like, he was one of the first people to really get into like dividends, and he built like $1 billion corporation essentially around buying match companies all over Europe, exploiting the monopoly, and like sort of raiding their cash reserves to pay out these dividends and then buy more companies. And he really like bubbled up this huge industry. And then at the end, like it exploded and he committed suicide. But it's like a very famous story of like monopolies.
Crazy. Yeah.
He just bought, like, basically he owned almost every single match company in Europe, and he started to buy out like all the mining and wood and stuff like that fed into it. Like it's a pretty cool story. I'll look it up and I'll bring it next week.
Cool. Yeah. No, I'd like to learn more about that.
Probably like one of the most egregious uses of monopoly power in history. So
It's wild that I have. Yeah. I feel embarrassed that I haven't heard about that. I should learn more.
I
about
feel
this.
embarrassed I can't remember any of the details you need to about.
Also, just don't move. But it looks like you have extremely broad shoulders right now. It's pretty amazing. I've just been like staring at this, and it just looks like you have just like this massive form. I love it. Your
Like
head is
biceps or whatever.
Yeah, your head is ending it perfectly at the top of the couch. Just something I thought I would. Yeah.
That is perfect.
I'm
gonna have
enjoying
to
it.
adjust this because my head's like I'm way smaller than you on screen. So
Yeah, well, I gotta the slow evolution of this will. I gotta improve on this for sure.
do you have any other points of Rockefeller or maybe monopolies in general, since we kind of got there? Like
No, I think my main point about monopolies is that I think the negative version of monopoly, which is one that is able to use their power to charge higher prices, the best way of breaking that is to allow the higher prices to exist on the market, thus incentivizing more competitors to enter the market. That would be my only thought. And that's and obviously there are exceptions when that's the case, but I think the tendency to run in and lower the price or break up the monopoly doesn't address the core issue at play.
Okay. I would say I actually don't think that is the biggest problem with monopolies. I would say the two biggest problems with monopolies that I see are that monopolies sometimes have the ability to guarantee themselves advantageous negotiating conditions, either through involvement with government or other industries. So like rail, for example, like he's able to get himself a better deal that stifles competition and like push other people out. And the other one I would say is that monopolies can have a negative effect on technological growth because they have the ability to push out emerging technologies that might be superior.
That's a good point. Yeah, I never thought
I
of
do
that.
think the market actually handles the pricing thing quite well through the mechanism that you're describing. Like we do tend to see that.
Yeah,
like OPEC is the classic example, right? Like as OPEC drove up prices, you saw hundreds of little oil and gas companies buy a handful of wells to make money, and then when prices plummeted, they all folded, and it kind of went back to the natural state of things, if you will. So
yes. Yeah, and I do think the ability to have better negotiating power is only bad insofar as a company will then use that power to hurt the consumer. I think having better negotiating power could be a boon to consumers if it produces the lower cost. And
yes, absolutely.
But I do agree with you that the point about technology is a very good point. And that, yeah, I think it's a tricky one to address. I think all we can do is try to, just try to.
Yeah. Like, I think if we look at the oil industry today, whether you agree with it or not, I think it's fairly clear that the oil industry is using its influence to try to crush the emergence of different technologies.
Absolutely.
Might be better. Whether you think they're better or not, like it is crushing them. There's a lot of lobbying. There's a lot of propaganda and stuff being done. Yeah,
no, and I think that I think that's kind of just the way of the world, and I think we just have to use, fight back against it and produce better narratives if we can counter propaganda. But yeah, just kind of looking at my notes, I think the main, and also there's this lady, Ida Tarbell, who's very famous for creating a lot of controversy around Rockefeller.
It's like the muckraker chick that wrote about him. Yeah,
and she was famous for creating this idea that he only cared about money and was just like this very kind of ugly looking leper person, and just like
we didn't mention that, like he was hairless at his death, right?
Oh yeah, he got alopecia later in life and had a series of toupees that he wore, and he would change them out so that they were slightly longer because he was very ashamed of this fact. And yeah, he definitely had a lot of health issues. He's also like obsessed with crackers and milk. And whenever he had health issues, he would only drink milk and eat crackers. Apparently, he loved that.
Really?
He also loved his children very much and would used to go on bike rides with them all the time. And it was known for like breaking out into like fits of like exuberant like laughter and glee when he would win a bike race. He'd also,
Yeah.
when he'd win like a financial contract or like make a bunch of money, he was known for skipping. He would skip. So he was like apparently a
Yeah.
very I don't know, seems like a very hilarious dude. But also just
Yeah.
like especially in his younger years, extremely cold and difficult to read, and just a very like apparently once he learned about his father's indiscretions during his 20s, he became a very cold and
Oh, that was another thing I wanted to touch on. Like, didn't he carry that through? Like, I had read in my readings that he like buried his father like in an unmarked grave somewhere and all these things, and like really like truly hated him down to his final years and everything.
I didn't know that he buried his father in an unmarked grave, but yeah, he definitely like when
Like,
people asked him about his father, he would often just not answer it because he didn't want to
yeah, like
lie.
he wanted his father's legacy to die and didn't
Yeah,
want him to have any credit for creating what he had built.
yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, he was. I think just I don't know. I still view him in a positive way. Honestly, I think he was very principled in his own way, lived by his
Yeah.
own code in a very consistent way. Obviously, he had issues. Um, I wish he was more of a free market hero, but like all of
Yeah.
the, but I think in order to be successful at the time, if he wanted to be someone who controlled the industry and had power and had the power to fund the philanthropic exercises he wanted to fund, he ultimately, I think, had to do what he did,
Okay.
and in the context of the current market.
Can
So
we
I,
pause right there? I really have to go to the bathroom.
yeah, for sure.
Okay. We'll cut the footage here.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I was trying to hold it, but
It's all good. It's all good.
when nature calls, you got to answer.
Yeah. So I think it can be argued that the way he acted wasn't necessary in the pursuit of his ideals, but he's obviously a very complex person. Yeah, so I'm comfortable saying that he did things that were unscrupulous and uh, underhanded,
Yes.
but I still think he's someone who I very much admire.
I don't think that our heroes have to be perfect.
Yeah, cool.
Like, it's okay to look at like someone, and when you look at like heroes of antiquity, they never felt they had to be perfect. Like, you read about like Beowulf or something, he's full of flaws and things like that. Are there any modern capitalists that you would compare or contrast Rockefeller to? Like people who
Ooh.
are active today?
Honestly, I don't feel like I know that much about modern capitalists. I know, like, I think the popular conception of a few, like Elon Musk, I feel like I have a very kind of standard understanding of what he's about. Uh, but like that's a good question. I mean, I guess are there any modern industrialists that I admire in the same way?
I was going to toss Bill Gates out there as another example of somebody who many would
Yeah,
argue built a monopoly and now devotes like he's dedicated to spending all of his money on charity.
absolutely. And that's yeah, like I think he's probably a great example. I don't know very much about him. I had someone send me a video recently all about Bill Gates, talking about how he's the most evil person in the world. And
Yeah.
the video
King of
actually,
Ebola.
yeah, and the video actually referenced Rockefeller as a comparative evil
Really?
person. And it actually made me want to read more about Rockefeller. And that's one of the main reasons I read this book. Not just the conversation I had with you, was because this friend of mine uh, has a view of Rockefeller as being this evil person that's similar to Bill Gates. So maybe I should look into the fact that I admire Bill Gates for similar reasons to Rockefeller.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
I think Bill Gates is similar to Rockefeller in that he has like we didn't really focus on this, but Rockefeller had like specific causes that he was very, very dedicated to and wasn't sort of like giving money across the board.
absolutely. Oh yeah,
Yeah. And I think Bill Gates is similar in that like I think he gets a lot of flack because he's very dedicated to like vaccination efforts, and some people are question that, I guess, or are
yeah.
against that or whatever, and that's sort of the source of the flack against him, in my opinion. But yeah, if you had something you wanted to,
That's just something that you reminded me of. That's something I also admire about Rockefeller is he didn't give money to charity simply to look like a good person. He took it very seriously, and he would often, like, he passed up so many opportunities to give charities to other universities, and he was known for saying that his proudest investment was the University of Chicago because of just what he felt that ended up becoming. And
interesting.
yeah, and I admire the fact that he didn't just give money indiscriminately. He took it very seriously. He wanted to. Uh, he very much believed that charity could be a harm to the poor. It could prop up and
Yeah,
just enable in a negative way, and so he was very conscious about how he gave money.
for sure. He was also very, very into prohibition,
Yeah,
perhaps for unscrupulous reasons, but also, as you stated, like he was probably religiously opposed to it, but
he was. Yeah,
he was
both
very
his
involved in fighting for prohibition in a time where it was becoming deeply unpopular.
yeah, for sure. He was him and his wife were both lifelong non-drinkers.
Yeah,
And yeah, apparently he raised his children in an environment where you'd say that he would, in a very, very purist environment, where he did use his wealth to essentially protect them in this home where they never had to leave his home, and he just
yeah,
uh, but he didn't shower them with gifts or whatever, but he did create an environment where they could grow up very pure. And apparently the fact that his son once smoked a pack of cigarettes was a huge disgrace and a great
yeah,
shame in the family. So they and apparently his son was quite meek and shy, and danced much to his mother's disapproval. And yeah, I'm really into learning just history for the interesting nuance and facts about different
it
things.
is fascinating.
Just
It's
even
cool when you dig deep enough into history to like get the freckles and blemishes, right? Like,
yeah,
people don't remember Rockefeller as a weird guy who skipped down the hall, but like in his
exactly.
time, that's what people would have thought of. Like, you know,
Yeah, yeah, the fact that he loved skipping I find so hilarious. Just because it counterbalances what we understand him to be in such an
exactly.
extreme
It
way.
makes him a real person instead of like an
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, and I think I love that. I like to learn more about the different people I admire, so much that I can actually know about all the ways in which they were an incredible person, but all the ways in which they were not an incredible person, and
Yeah,
just have
we
that
tend
whole
to like
balanced picture.
cartoonify a lot of figures in
Yeah,
history, I think.
they're either demons or they're just these gods, and yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any closing remarks on Rockefeller? I think,
Uh,
or no, am I supposed to go first?
you're supposed to go first, absolutely.
Okay. My closing remarks on Rockefeller is that I don't think it should be. I think it needs to be appreciated how much he personally changed the world, both for good and for bad. Um, and I think it's important that we judge monopolists and capitalists by more than just how much wealth they had, but also by what they did with it.
Cool. All
What are
right.
your
Yeah, I would say that while learning about Rockefeller, I definitely had to come to terms with the fact that he was more unscrupulous than I would have liked to believe, but I'm still willing to believe that, at least in his mind, the ends justified the means, and he had a noble cause that he was pursuing. And I think just the way in which you dealt with other businesses was often how I think men view themselves as dealing with other men. Like you're not so concerned about like stepping on toes if you're like going to war with other men. And I think that's how he kind of viewed it. It's like he was kind of taking up arms to fight for the cause. But yeah, so I think he was just a complex person who was very successful, and unfortunately not in the purest of ways sometimes. But I think he's not a pure example of much, but he's a very fascinating character example, and just I wouldn't say a good argument for free market or anything else. He's just a fascinating character who's very complex.
Yeah, he's a very interesting figure in history.
Yeah. And I would like to know more about him. I'd like to learn more about also the Rockefeller Foundation and how it apparently tarnished the reputation further after his death. Because I know the Rockefeller Foundation is known for doing, certain immoral things, but I don't know about what that is. So there are things about him that I'd like to know more about, which is primarily the ways in which he took out his competition, and also why the Rockefeller Foundation is known to be a negative thing today.
For sure. Do you want to shout out the name of the book one last time for anyone who wants to read it?
I sure do. The book is entitled John D. Rockefeller, The Original Titan by J.R. MacGreggor.
Awesome. Available wherever audiobooks are sold.
I would assume so. Cool, man. That was awesome. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And farewell, everybody.
Farewell.